It was Halloween night, and the road stretched endlessly in front of Tom, a seasoned trucker who'd seen every kind of highway oddity over his 20 years behind the wheel. The cab of his rig was cozy, filled with the smell of old coffee and engine oil, and the faint sound of classic rock hummed from the radio. But tonight felt different. The moon hung low, heavy and orange, casting an eerie glow over the desolate road. Tom was hauling a load across Route 88, a path notorious among truckers for stories of strange apparitions and disappearances. He'd never believed in any of it, until tonight. A sudden crackle on his CB radio made him jump, static hissing like a whisper. "Anyone out there on Route 88?" a voice called, thin and tinged with panic. Tom reached for the mic, hesitating as the static deepened into an unnatural growl before clearing again. "Yeah, I'm here," he replied, forcing a laugh to shake off the chill crawling up his spine. "Who's this?" The line crackled again, silence so thick it made his ears ring. Just as he was about to put the mic down, a different voice, one low and gravelly, cut through the static. "Turn around, Tom." Tom's heart thumped painfully in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck bristled. How did they know his name? A cold wind swept through the cab, and Tom shivered, glancing at the empty seat beside him. He shook his head, trying to brush off the unease. Ahead, the road split, one path leading to a rest stop where he could pull over and clear his head. But as he neared, his headlights caught movement. A figure standing by the roadside. Tom's foot eased off the accelerator as he squinted at the shape. It was a man in a worn, tattered uniform, an old badge glinting in the moonlight. The man raised a hand in a slow wave, his eyes dark hollows beneath the brim of his hat. Against his better judgment, Tom rolled the truck to a stop and opened the window. "Need a ride, friend?" he called, his voice wavering slightly. The man nodded and climbed into the cab without a word, the chill following him like a storm cloud. Tom glanced at the passenger, who stared straight ahead, expressionless. "You heading far?" he asked, trying to break the tension. The man turned his head slowly, his eyes locking with Tom's. "Farther than you think," he replied, his voice resonant and hollow. Tom's fingers tightened on the wheel as he drove. The man sat motionless, except for his eyes, which seemed to flicker and shift, reflecting shadows that weren't there. The radio, still faintly playing, started to skip and warp, the music bending into a static-laden chant. "Strange weather tonight," Tom muttered, breaking the silence. Tom's fingers tightened on the wheel as he drove. The man sat motionless except for his eyes, which seemed to flicker and shift, reflecting shadows that weren't there. The radio, still faintly playing, started to skip and warp, the music bending into a static-laden chant. Tom swallowed hard, glancing at the man. He was still staring ahead, but his lips moved, forming silent words that Tom couldn't understand. A shiver crept down his spine, cold as ice. "What did you say?" Tom asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's head turned with an unsettling slowness, eyes meeting Tom's with a depth that felt endless. His voice, when it came, was a whisper that seemed to echo from the corners of the cab. "You should never have stopped." The cab lights flickered, plunging the interior into brief darkness. Tom's pulse raced as the shadows inside the truck seemed to grow, twisting and shifting as if alive. The headlights caught movement on the road ahead, a deer staring wide-eyed into the oncoming truck. "Watch out!" The man's voice roared, suddenly loud and forceful. Tom jerked the wheel hard, tires screeching as the truck veered to the side. The deer bolted, disappearing into the woods. The cab lurched, and for a moment Tom was weightless as the truck skidded dangerously close to the edge of the road. He fought the wheel, muscles straining, until the truck ground to a shuddering halt, steam rising from the engine. Panting, Tom's eyes darted to the passenger seat. It was empty. He blinked, sweat trickling down his temple. The man had vanished without a sound, leaving only the faint scent of smoke in the air. His heart thudded as he scanned the dark forest beyond the windshield. The radio crackled again and a voice whispered through the static, softer this time, almost mournful. "Turn back, Tom. It's not safe." His hand shook as he reached for the mic. "Who are you?" he shouted into the receiver, his voice edged with desperation. The static hummed, then fell silent. Tom's eyes darted to the mirror, half expecting to see the man standing on the road behind him. Instead, the reflection showed the dark silhouette of a truck, its headlights off, parked a short distance back. But when he turned to look, the road was empty. A feeling of dread washed over him. He couldn't shake the idea that he was being hunted. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the cab and carrying with it a sound like laughter. It swirled around the truck, a chorus of voices blending with the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches. Tom knew he needed to move. He slammed the truck into gear and pulled back onto the road, pushing the accelerator harder than he should. The forest blurred by, shadows racing alongside him like silent specters. For a moment, he thought he might outrun whatever was following him. But the road twisted, narrowing as if the trees were closing in. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A dark figure running parallel to the truck, impossibly fast, its limbs jerking in unnatural ways. Tom's breath came in short gasps as he pressed the pedal to the floor. The truck roared, but so did the figure outside, its growl vibrating through the air. It leaped across the road, landing on the hood of the truck with a thud that shook the entire cab. The windshield splintered, a web of cracks spreading from the impact. "Get off," Tom screamed, swerving wildly. The thing on the hood glared at him with eyes that glowed an eerie, sickly yellow. Its mouth opened in a twisted grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The cab lights flickered again, and Tom could see its hand, clawed and skeletal, reaching for the glass. It was closing in around him. The trees on either side loomed tall and dark, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the moonlight. Tom's headlights cut through the suffocating blackness, casting long, twitching shadows on the road. A sudden thumping noise echoed from the back of the truck, rhythmic and insistent. Tom's blood turned cold. He glanced at his side mirrors, half expecting to see something climbing the back, but there was nothing but darkness behind him. The sound grew louder, now accompanied by a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the entire cab. Before he could react, the CB radio flared to life once more. But this time, it wasn't static or whispers. It was a scream, sharp and filled with agony. Tom flinched, his grip on the wheel faltering for just a moment, and that was all it took. The truck shuddered violently as if something had struck the side, and it veered off the road, skidding into the gravel shoulder before coming to a jarring stop. Breathing hard, Tom scanned his surroundings. The woods were silent, holding their breath. The thumping noise from the back of the truck had stopped, replaced by a different sound, a soft scratching like fingernails on metal. It was close, too close. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. It was the man from earlier, but now his eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red. He stepped forward, and with each movement, shadows seemed to peel away from the trees and follow him, writhing and shifting. "Why are you here?" Tom shouted, more to drown out his own fear than anything else. The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised an arm, pointing at the cab. The scratching sound intensified, and Tom turned just in time to see something pale and bony reach through the cracked window and claw at the door handle. The grotesque hand. The beam illuminated a skeletal limb, black veins bulging beneath translucent skin. It recoiled with a hiss, retreating into the dark, but not before Tom caught a glimpse of its owner, a hollow-eyed, emaciated figure with a mouth stretched into a twisted grin. Heart racing, Tom fumbled to lock the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed alive now, full of whispering voices and rustling leaves. The man outside stood still, watching as if waiting for something. "Leave me alone," Tom yelled, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. But the voices only grew louder, echoing in a chant that made his vision blur. Suddenly, the glow from his headlights dimmed and flickered out. The darkness closed in like a living thing, pressing against the cab windows and muting every sound except the rhythmic pounding of his heart. Then, silence. The chanting stopped, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing. Tom dared to look up, his eyes meeting the shadowed figure now standing at the edge of the windshield. "Your journey ends here," the man said, a smile spreading across his gaunt face. The cab door flew open, a force pulling Tom from his seat with a strength that defied explanation. He screamed as he was dragged into the cold, unforgiving night, the forest swallowing him whole. The truck, now abandoned, sat quietly on the side of the road, the wind rustling through the trees as if nothing had happened. When other truckers passed by in the early dawn, they saw Tom's rig, its doors open, the cab empty. No trace of Tom was ever found, but they said if you listened closely on Route 88, you could still hear the faint sound of a man's voice calling for help, lost in the shadows. Jake was an experienced trucker who prided himself on knowing every shortcut and back road in the state. Halloween night found him hauling a shipment across a desolate stretch of highway, known for being empty and eerie. The radio was playing an old rock station, crackling every few minutes with static as he drove through pockets of bad reception. It was well past midnight when Jake's stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in hours. Just as he was considering pulling over to snack on a protein bar, a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance. Maddie's Diner. Open 24 hours. The sign glowed an unnatural red and purple, casting a surreal hue over the gravel parking lot. Jake squinted, surprised that a diner could exist in the middle of nowhere. He pulled into the lot, gravel crunching under the tires, and shut off the engine. The silence was immediate and suffocating. The diner's lights buzzed and flickered, and he could swear he heard faint whispers on the wind. Pushing the thought aside, Jake stepped inside. The diner was almost empty, save for a waitress behind the counter who looked up and smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. The jukebox in the corner played a slow, mournful tune that seemed just slightly off-key. "Evenin', trucker," the waitress drawled, her voice raspy and worn. Her name tag read, Maddie. Jake sat at a booth by the window and ordered a cup of coffee. As he waited, he glanced around, noting the outdated decor, red vinyl seats, a checkerboard floor, and black and white photos of smiling patrons. Only, as he looked closer, their smiles seemed strained, eyes wide with something that might have been fear. "Here's your coffee," Maddie said, setting the steaming mug down in front of him. Her hand lingered just a moment too long, and Jake noticed a strange scar running along her wrist. "Thanks," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. The coffee had an odd bitter scent, but he took a sip anyway, grimacing at the taste. Jake glanced at the clock. It hadn't moved since he'd walked in. A chill trickled down his spine as the music from the jukebox warped, slowing down to a deep, distorted pitch. He looked around, noticing that the shadows seemed thicker, creeping along the walls like they were alive. Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled and 3 men walked in. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless. They took seats at the counter without speaking, their eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Maddie's demeanor shifted, her smile fading as she took their orders in silence. When she turned to Jake, her eyes darted toward the back door. She mouthed, "Run," so quickly he almost missed it. Before he could process her warning, one of the men stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a high-pitched whine. "Trucker," he said, voice echoing unnaturally. "You're not supposed to be here." Jake's heart pounded as he realized that whatever was happening, it was far beyond anything he'd encountered before. The man's hollow eyes locked onto Jake, unblinking and devoid of any human warmth. The other 2 men followed suit, standing up in unison, their movements jerky as if they were marionettes controlled by unseen strings. A sickly silence hung in the air, thick and stifling. Jake's pulse quickened as he recalled Maddie's silent warning. He glanced at her, hoping for some reassurance. but her gaze was frozen in terror, eyes wide and pleading. The room seemed to grow colder, and a sudden oppressive darkness crept into the corners, pressing against the flickering lights. "Enjoying your coffee?" The first man spoke, his voice low and distorted, as if coming from a distant echo. Jake's fingers twitched. He needed to move, to do something before whatever was happening escalated further. Without answering, he pushed the mug away and stood up, the metal legs of the chair screeching against the tile. "Going somewhere?" The second man tilted his head, a slow grin splitting his pale face. The sound of his voice felt wrong, like nails scraping on a chalkboard. The door to the kitchen swung open, and Maddie emerged holding a large kitchen knife, her hands shaking. "Get out now!" she shouted, her voice breaking the suffocating tension. The three men turned their attention to her, and their smiles disappeared. Jake didn't wait for an invitation. He bolted toward the back door, his boots pounding on the tile as the room erupted in chaos. The jukebox blared a cacophony of distorted music, and the lights flashed wildly. He heard Maddie scream, but he forced himself not to look back. The back door slammed open, and Jake stumbled into the cold night air. The gravel crunched beneath him as he sprinted toward his truck, heart thundering in his chest. Behind him, the diner's windows shuddered as if something was pounding on them from the inside. Shadows writhed against the glass, forming shapes that defied explanation. He threw himself into the cab, locking the doors and jamming the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The truck roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, tires spinning and spraying gravel as he sped away. As the diner shrank in his rearview mirror, Jake's breath came in ragged gasps. For a moment, he dared to think he was safe. But then, the radio crackled to life, not with music but with a familiar voice, low and echoing. "You can't run, trucker. We'll see you again." The road stretched on endlessly before him, swallowed by darkness. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel, the road slipping beneath the wheels at breakneck speed. The words from the radio echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. He kept glancing in his rearview mirror, expecting to see the diner or those ghostly figures chasing after him. But the highway was empty, a barren stretch of asphalt flanked by shadowy trees. He reached out to switch off the radio, but before he could, it burst into static, then faded to silence. The only sounds were the rumble of the truck's engine and the thud of his racing heart. The clock on the dashboard blinked 3 a.m., the digits flickering erratically as though struggling to stay lit. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the road ahead. Jake's reflexes kicked in and he swerved, the truck skidding dangerously as the tires struggled to find traction. The headlights caught a glimpse of something tall and gaunt standing at the roadside, a figure that looked disturbingly familiar with hollow eyes and a gaping, unnatural grin. "No!" Jake shouted as he slammed the brakes. The truck groaned and lurched to a stop, but when he looked again, the road was empty. His breathing was ragged, each inhale a struggle against the tightness in his chest. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on him like a living thing. He leaned back, trying to steady himself, but before he could gather his thoughts, the engine sputtered and died. The dashboard lights flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He was trapped in his own cab, surrounded by nothing but the cold and the whispers of the wind. A soft tap, tap, tap came from the passenger side window. Jake's blood froze as he turned his head slowly. A face was pressed against the glass, pale and gaunt, eyes wide and unblinking. It was one of the men from the diner, staring at him with that same eerie smile. Before he could react, the figure vanished, leaving only a smudge on the window. The air grew colder, and the fog that formed on the glass seemed to move, spelling out 2 words: "Not alone." Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, but it was dead, the screen a black mirror reflecting his panicked face. He forced himself to think, to act. He had to get out of there. Pushing open the door, he stepped into the cold night. The silence was broken only by the rustling of the leaves and the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, but the road was empty, The shadows between the trees seemed to dance and shift, taunting him. A low laugh echoed from somewhere unseen, wrapping around him like a noose. Jake's chest tightened as the realization set in. He wasn't going to escape this place. Whatever haunted that diner had followed him, and now it claimed the road as its own. A light appeared in the distance, headlights approaching. Relief flooded through him as he ran toward the vehicle, waving his arms frantically. The car slowed, and as it drew closer, Jake's heart sank. The driver's face was gaunt, eyes hollow and red, just like the figures from the diner. The car passed him without slowing, disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the chilling laughter behind. The road stretched on, endless and unforgiving, as Jake stood there, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The last thing he heard was the whisper from the trees. "Welcome home." Samantha, a veteran trucker, had seen it all on the highways. Endless stretches of lonely roads, bizarre encounters with strange folks, and the occasional oddball truck stop. But this night was different. It wasn't the usual grumbling weather or the typical fatigue that gnawed at her. It was something else. Something unsettling. It had been a long day, and the clock in her truck's cab read well past midnight when she hit Highway 52, a desolate stretch of road through the Appalachian Mountains. This route, known for its isolation and eerie history, had become infamous among truckers. Whispers floated around about strange happenings, ghost sightings, and inexplicable accidents. Samantha had always been a skeptic, dismissing the superstitions as just that, stories meant to pass the time. But tonight, as she barreled down that empty road, she felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, as though she were being watched. The wind howled outside, whipping through the trees that flanked the road like dark, skeletal fingers. The headlights of her truck cast long shadows on the tarmac, stretching far ahead, but never quite reaching the road's end. She pressed on, her mind distracted by the memories of her last conversation at the truck stop. A group of older truckers had warned her about Highway 52, told her to take another route if she could, but she'd brushed them off. After all, superstitions weren't her thing. What could possibly happen on a straight, empty road? Then, out of nowhere, she saw it, a figure standing just off the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a faded white gown, her hair disheveled and wild. At first, Samantha thought it was just a trick of the mind, maybe a hitchhiker in distress, but there was something wrong about her. The woman didn't move. She just stood there staring into the oncoming headlights. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale as if drained of life. Samantha's grip tightened on the steering wheel. She slowed down, but the figure didn't flinch. Her stomach churned. She debated stopping, but the voice in her head screamed not to. Something about that woman didn't sit right. She stepped on the gas, speeding past the figure, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her still standing there. But the road was empty. The woman had vanished. Samantha let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was just her nerves playing tricks on her. Nothing more. She shook her head and muttered to herself, "Get a grip, Sam. You're just tired." But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She kept her eyes on the road, the eerie feeling creeping back. And then, in the distance, she saw another figure, a man this time, standing at the edge of the road. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face obscured by the shadows. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the shape of the figure from the rearview mirror. The woman. She was behind him. Samantha's heart raced. She slammed her foot down on the brake, but the truck kept coasting forward, moving as though the road itself were pulling her in. She could hear the faintest whisper, a voice on the wind, cold and beckoning. The truck slowed to a crawl as Samantha's head swiveled, trying to make sense of the figures now standing in the middle of the road, just out of reach of the truck's headlights. The wind picked up again, carrying that eerie whisper that seemed to call her name, faint at first, then growing louder. Samantha. Her hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the wheel. She wanted to speed past, to escape whatever was happening, but the truck seemed frozen. as though the very road had come alive and refused to let her go. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching her, their eyes hollow and vacant. The woman in the white gown was there, but there was something new. A man now stood beside her, his body contorted in a way that shouldn't have been possible. His arms stretched unnaturally long, and his face twisted into a grotesque smile, lips pulled back in an almost inhuman way. A chill ran down Samantha's spine as she realized these were no ordinary travelers. She had heard of ghostly apparitions on the highway, of spirits lost in the fog, but she never believed them. This felt different. She wasn't imagining it. Her truck began to shake and the headlights flickered, casting wild shadows over the figures. The whisper grew louder, now unmistakably clear. "Turn back. Turn back." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as the figures started moving closer. She had no choice. She had to act fast. Her foot slammed down on the accelerator, and the truck roared forward, speeding down the road. But the figures kept pace, walking alongside the truck, their feet never touching the ground. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but the figures were gone. The road was once again empty. Samantha didn't dare slow down. She pushed the truck harder, desperate to get away from whatever haunted Highway 52. But as the miles passed, the strange feeling of being followed never left. The radio, which had been silent until then, suddenly crackled to life, blasting static into the cab. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the voice returned, low and guttural, echoing through the radio. "Turn back." Samantha's hands trembled as she reached to switch the radio off, but before she could, it cut out, leaving her in the deafening silence. She felt her heart thudding in her ears as she continued speeding down the desolate highway, the fog thickening around her. Something wasn't right, and she knew she couldn't escape it by running. The hours stretched on, or so it felt. Samantha's mind was racing, her eyes flicking to every shadow at the side of the road. The truck was no longer responding the way it should. It felt sluggish, the engine sputtering every so often, as if it was fighting against the very road she was on. She glanced at the GPS screen, trying to reassure herself that she was making progress. But when she checked it again, her heart sank. The same stretch of road, the same winding path, repeated over and over again on the screen. There were no exits, no turns, nothing to indicate where she was or how long she had been driving. "This can't be happening," Samantha muttered under her breath, her voice shaky. No, this isn't real." She slammed her fist on the dashboard, but the GPS didn't change. It wasn't just the GPS that was malfunctioning. Everything around her seemed off, distorted, as though the road was twisting and warping in ways it shouldn't. The headlights couldn't cut through the fog anymore, and the once familiar route had become a maze that led nowhere. Suddenly, a new figure appeared in front of her. A man, standing in the middle of the road, his face obscured by shadows. But this time, the figure didn't wait. As her truck drew nearer, it moved toward her with an unnatural speed, closing the distance in a blink of an eye. With a scream, Samantha jerked the wheel to the left, but there was no road to swerve onto. Her truck skidded out of control and the world spun around her. The brakes screeched as the truck veered off the road and into the forest. The world went black. Samantha's breath came in ragged gasps, the taste of fear thick in her mouth as she opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was darkness, deep and impenetrable. For a moment, she couldn't make sense of where she was. The truck had stopped, its engine sputtering to a halt, and everything around her seemed unnervingly quiet. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. She blinked, trying to clear her vision. When she looked out the windshield, she saw nothing but dense trees, their twisted branches stretching into the fog like skeletal hands. The once familiar road had vanished, replaced by an unnatural stillness. There was no sign of the highway, no sign of anything familiar. Samantha shook her head, fighting to steady herself. "Get a grip, Sam. It's just a crash. You're just disoriented." she muttered, though her voice sounded small and fragile in the face of this creeping terror. Her hands fumbled to unbuckle the seatbelt and she stumbled out of the truck. The air was damp and thick with the smell of moss and decay. The fog clung to her skin, and she shivered as she stepped onto the soft, uneven ground. The forest stretched out in every direction, dark and silent, but for the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. There was something wrong, though. Something that made her skin crawl. The trees. They seemed to lean closer, almost as if they were watching her, closing in around her with every step she took. She turned around, but the truck had already disappeared from view, swallowed by the fog. "Hello?" Samantha called, her voice echoing through the stillness. "Is anyone out here?" No response, only the oppressive silence. Her heart raced as she looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The trees felt like a maze, each one identical to the next, and no matter which direction she went in, the fog seemed to grow thicker, the forest darker. The panic started to claw at her chest. She pulled out her phone, praying for a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no Wi-Fi, no connection. The screen flickered once, then went black. Samantha cursed under her breath. She was alone, isolated in this strange forest, and she had no idea where she was. The road had vanished, and with it, any hope of finding her way out. Then a noise. A distant sound, soft at first but growing louder. A whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper sounded like it was calling her name. "Samantha. Samantha." Her pulse quickened as she spun around, looking desperately for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. The trees were empty. The fog was thick. And yet, she could still hear it, faint and distant, calling her name over and over again. "Samantha." Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to move forward, unsure of where she was headed but knowing she couldn't stand still. The voice was getting louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from any direction she could pinpoint, but it seemed to echo from all around her. It was a sickening feeling, like the forest itself was alive, watching her every move, as if something was playing with her, luring her deeper into the heart of the woods. And then she saw something in the distance, a light, flickering weakly through the fog. At first, she thought it was just a trick of her mind, but it grew brighter, more distinct. Someone was out there. Someone had to be. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled toward the light, desperate for human contact, for safety. She pushed her way through the trees, ignoring the branches that scratched at her skin. The whispering had stopped, but the eerie feeling of being watched remained, a constant presence in the back of her mind. The light grew stronger, and soon, she emerged into a small clearing. At the center of it was an old, run-down shack, its wooden walls warped and weathered, as if it had been abandoned for years. The faint glow emanated from a lantern hanging by the door. "Hello?" Samantha called again, her voice shaking. "Is anyone there?" No answer, just the wind and the faint rustling of the trees. She hesitated for a moment, standing at the edge of the clearing, torn between the desire to keep running and the hope that someone, anyone, was inside. The desperation in her chest pushed her forward, and she approached the shack, each step slow and deliberate. As she reached the door, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The air felt heavier here, thicker, like the very atmosphere was suffused with an ancient, unspoken dread. The lantern flickered again, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. She knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. "Is anyone there?" she asked again, louder this time. The door creaked open, just a crack, and she could see nothing inside. The darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to expect, but this wasn't it. A cold, hollow voice came from within the shadows, its tone slow and deliberate. "Come in, Samantha. We've been waiting for you." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The door opened wider, as if inviting her in. The voice, though chilling, was undeniably familiar, and it sent a shiver of dread down her spine. "Samantha," the voice repeated, its tone almost a whisper. "You've always been part of this, haven't you?" Her eyes darted around the clearing, but there was no one in sight. No movement, no figures hiding in the shadows. Just the oppressive silence and the eerie glow of the lantern. She took a step back, but the door swung open fully, revealing the inside of the shack. It was dark, but she could make out the faint outline of something, or someone, standing in the corner. A strange compulsion gripped her, as though something beyond her control was urging her forward. She stepped into the shack, her feet heavy with dread. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, the walls lined with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. The lantern light flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the room. She could make out a figure standing in the far corner, an old man, hunched over, his face obscured by a hood. His eyes gleamed from beneath the shadow of the hood, reflecting the dim light like twin pools of darkness. "You shouldn't have come here, Samantha," he said softly, his voice hoarse and gravelly. "But it's too late now." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. The words hung in the air, thick with menace. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" The man's lips curled into a twisted grin. "I'm the one who watches. I'm the one who waits. You've always been part of this, whether you knew it or not." Before she could respond, the room seemed to close in around her. The walls pulsed with a sickening rhythm, the symbols on them shifting and writhing like living creatures. The lantern flickered violently, casting strange, distorted shapes across the room. Samantha's breath quickened, her mind racing. This wasn't just some haunted shack. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for her. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, everything went silent. The lantern went out. The air grew still. The man was gone. Samantha stood alone in the darkness, her mind reeling. The shack was now just an empty, decaying shell. She ran for the door, desperate to escape, but the outside world had changed. The fog was thicker than before, and the road had vanished entirely. She was trapped in the forest, with nowhere to run. The whispering voice returned, louder this time, as if it were inside her mind. "You can't escape, Samantha.